The Wings of Florif, Book 3, The King's Knight, Part 1, The Painting, Chapter 1, A Flock of Harpies. It was another dull evening sitting by one of the three entrances to the encampment. It was cold today, and there had even been a little bit of snow earlier on, despite it still being summer. Against her better judgment, Anida had left what little shelter her tent had provided from the weather in order to warm herself by one of the fires, along with 6 of her fellow soldiers. It was hard to get comfortable. Her heavy plate armour got very hot very quickly when she sat close to the fire, yet if she didn't sit close enough, that same armour would amplify the cold in a similar way. "Maybe you should leave your armour in the tent," one of the soldiers had suggested. It was something Anida had considered herself several times. Indeed, many of the soldiers on duty with her by these pillars seemed to have done just that. They sat around the fires in various states of undress, some of them with a few of the smaller items of armour, others with no armour at all, just a weapon to signify that they were actually soldiers in the first place. Anida had tried to insist that they should be prepared for combat at all times of the day or night. While it was true that sometimes people needed to sleep, she had insisted that those on duty should always be properly dressed, complete with a full suit of armour. There had been more than one occasion where she had given someone a dressing down because they hadn't been wearing the proper uniform. She was certain that no one had taken her seriously. Even the officers among the men, supposedly under her control, didn't seem to really think of her as their commander. They listened to her, but they seemed to treat her and her commands like the suggestions of a child. She was a woman, the only woman in the entire army. She was a token officer, wearing the armour of a knight without actually holding the rank. The men didn't respect her. They put up with her, but they didn't respect her. In the end, this was all her father's fault. It went back to the very first day the encampment had been founded. The peasants of the many villages had just begun to move in, and they had set about felling the trees in order to make the clearing that would house everyone. Manglos quickly erected the dome, marking out 3 places where it could be breached, so that stragglers could still enter the encampment and patrols could still leave it. These breaches in the dome had to be guarded. Step forward, Anida's father, Sir Grant, the greatest weapons trainer the Dukedom of the Moth had ever known, and he had volunteered to lead the soldiers guarding one of the 3 gateways. This was of little interest to Anida, although at the time she remembered thinking that guard duty was a waste of her father's talents. "Anida, my dear," Sir Grant had asked. It was the day after they had moved in, and the dome had been erected. Anida had been summoned to her father by a messenger. "Yes, father," Anida replied. She still had many things to do. She hadn't settled into her room at the castle properly yet. There was a lot of unpacking to do, but she loved her father, and if he needed a favour, she was only too willing to help. "I've just received word that the Duke is holding a war meeting up at the castle, and I am expected to attend. I was hoping you would hold the fort for me here, until I get back." "You have quite a few officers here who could perform such a task, father," Anida had pointed out. "I know, daughter, but I'd like you to do it," her father had insisted. "I'll only be an hour, 2 at the most." That had been nearly a week ago. Her father had never returned from his war meeting. She had seen him about since then, and had even challenged him on one occasion. I just need to check up on something, and then I'll be right back," he had said. Again, he had vanished. Anida had come to the conclusion that he had done this on purpose. It wasn't like him to ignore his responsibilities, and so he must have arranged things to put her in charge at the gate. She didn't like it. She didn't like it because she felt she'd been played. She didn't like it because the men didn't like having her in charge. Even now, her father wasn't even in the encampment. She didn't know where he was. He had left yesterday morning with Duke Greyforth and approximately 500 soldiers, a mix of cavalry archers and men-at-arms. It was a small army, yet big enough to make a quick and devastating strike at some elven target. Personally, she suspected that they were headed for the border and Castle the Moth, with an eye to taking the place back. Anida's attention was drawn away from her thoughts as a 7th soldier came to join them by the fire. He was carrying a flat wooden tray on which were sitting 8 pint mugs containing a thick brown liquid. It was a kind of homemade ale that had been brewed by one of the local villagers and that hadn't had a chance to properly ferment. The alcoholic content was next to nothing, but it was still all that was available in the encampment at the moment. The soldier offered the first mug to Anida. At least some of the men seemed to recognise her rank. And then he distributed the other drinks to those sitting around the fire with her, before taking hold of the last mug himself and finding the empty space that had been made when he had left it to fetch the drinks in the first place. Anida took a sip from her mug. There was an ugly bitterness about the brew. It was very weak, little more than flavoured water. She felt it needed more time to develop a proper flavour. The conversation of the soldiers was often quite heavy and baldy, and generally ventured towards the obscene. "Do you have a boyfriend?" one of the soldiers asked. Anida didn't mind such questions. "I don't have time for a boyfriend." Sometimes when asked this question, she wondered if the man was thinking about applying for the job. "What about a girlfriend then?" another soldier asked her. Anida tended to ignore such questions, as well as those who wanted to know the details about her sex life. At best, she would give the one who asked the question a withering look. It wasn't easy being the only woman among so many young hormone-saturated men. The conversation continued, and Anida let it continue without her, choosing instead to look around the rest of the encampment. The place had come a long way in the week since they'd moved here. There were huts as far as the eye could see. They occupied nearly every space between the pillars and the old ruined castle, and beyond. Not too far from where she was sitting was one of the 16 outer totems that ring the encampment. Mangloss wasn't there at the moment, but as long as he kept to his schedule, she would see him within the next hour or two. That would signify it was time to go and grab something for dinner. As she looked about the encampment, Anida's attention was caught by a small group of children running about some nearby huts, playing some kind of chase game. It was a mixed group of boys and girls, all playing together like old friends. Their ages varied widely. The youngest looked as if he was around 3, while the oldest had to be at least 10. Anida noticed them mainly because both Kel and Minitilda were with them. Minitilda was 7 now. She was growing into a proper little lady, something that Anida herself had never had the chance to do with a father like hers. Anida had been forced to learn how to wield a sword from the age of 3. Minitilda, as of yet, hadn't even touched a sword. Greyforth had insisted that she be brought up properly. If anyone was hoping that snow was going to settle, it would have to be Minitilda. She loved the snow, and for the last couple of years she had been out of the castle grounds as soon as the first flakes fell, trying to build a snowman. Kel was a year younger than his sister, but he was growing up to be quite the bully. Before the invasion, it hadn't been unusual to see him in the courtyard learning how to wield a sword. Kel was one of the youngest among the group he was currently playing with, but he had inherited his musculature and indeed his outlook on life from his father. Anida was sure that Kel would never actually hit anyone, probably just as well considering some of the boys he was playing with were nearly twice his age, but occasionally she could hear him boasting, "My father is the Duke. That means you do what I say." After sitting at the fire for so long, Anida's legs were beginning to feel a little cramped. She stood up and grabbed her helmet. "Sir," one of the soldiers at the fire said. "Just stretching my legs," Anida replied. "Oh," the soldier commented, his face twisting into a mischievous grin. "Need a hand?" There was raucous laughter from the others sitting at the fire. Anida closed her eyes for a second. "I'm going for a walk. Nothing more." She opened her eyes and looked at him. The man grinned back. Anida sighed and turned away. These soldiers always seemed to have just one thing on their minds. She stepped away from the fire and skirted the men heading towards the pillars and making a point to walk directly away from the place where the man had most likely thought she was headed. She had taken at most 5 steps when she heard Minitilda screaming. At first Anida thought nothing of it. That young girl was always screaming for one reason or another. She would scream when she was having a good time, and she would scream when she didn't get her way. She would also scream when she was in pain, but Minitilda didn't look as if she was in pain. "Harpies!" Minitilda screamed loudly, panic in her voice. "Harpies!" She pointed towards the sky in the west of the encampment. The children who had been playing with Minitilda began to flee as if they were in immediate danger. Kel ran with them, leaving Minitilda standing there, frozen to the spot with fear. Anida broke into a run in order to get a better look at what Mini-Tilda was pointing at. Some of the trees lining the edge of the encampment were quite tall, but from the right angle Anida could see exactly what Mini-Tilda had spotted. A large flock of harpies were flying straight towards them from the horizon. At this distance it was hard to see if it was an entire village, or merely a war party. Clearly, though, the flock was larger than a simple hunting party. Anida wasn't the only one to have heard Mini-Tilda's warning. All around her, the men guarding the eastern pillars began to come alert. They reached for their weapons, and without so much as a single order from her, they began to form themselves into combat-ready lines. For the first time since Anida had taken command of the soldiers by the pillars, they moved like a well-oiled military machine. "Nobody panic," Anida said needlessly. The harpies were a long way off yet. There was still plenty of time. She walked briskly over to her men. It was good to see how they had come together so quickly to face this potential threat. She selected one of her men at random and tapped him gently on the shoulder. "What's your name, soldier?" she asked. The soldier turned his face towards her, clearly torn between answering and keeping an eye on the approaching threat. "Merrick, sir." Ma'am. Sir." "Well, Merrick," Anida said, "we might have to fight harpies shortly. It would be good if we had some archers here, just in case they find a way into the encampment. Run to—" She hesitated. Her father, Sir Grant, was in charge of the army, but he had left with Duke Greyforth. The next in line was Duke Ganespa. The problem was that so far he had treated her like a servant, not worthy of his attention. She didn't really want to ask anything of him. "Mangloss. Go and find Mangloss and tell him we need archers." The man hesitated. He glanced towards the approaching harpies, and then he broke ranks and started to run towards the old ruined castle. Anida watched the man go. She doubted he would find the mage at the castle at this hour. Most likely, the wizard would be attending to one of the many totems scattered about the perimeter. She shook her head. Mangloss was a very busy man. Maybe she should just have swallowed her pride and sent him to Duke Ganespa for help. It was too late now, unless she deemed to send a second runner. She clasped her helmet tightly and walked slowly to the front of the lines of the soldiers guarding the pillars. She didn't really want to be here, but as she was here and she was in charge, she would make an example and lead from the front. The harpies had gotten close enough now that she didn't need to stand anywhere special to see them through the trees. There were hundreds of them, young and old alike, children flying alongside their mothers. Clearly, this was an entire village on the move. Anida looked back to her men and at the worried faces they wore. Harpies could be quite vicious in combat. They showed little, if any, mercy to their foe, often getting caught in the bloodlust that would last until every one of the enemies lay dead. If they did take prisoners, there were any number of games the huntresses might play with their prey. Again, the result was usually death for the poor unfortunate. Anida stood there and watched as the harpies approached. She felt the cold hand of fear clutch at her heart and tried to remind herself that the flock wasn't heading toward their encampment deliberately. They just happened to be flying this way, and the illusory dome that Mangloss had erected over the place would protect everyone inside. In a few minutes the harpies would fly over the top of the dome, the panic would be over, and the men would stand down. The harpies got closer and closer, some of them flying so low that they were skimming the tops of the trees. They got so close that Anida was able to make out some of their features. Her men began to get a little restless. It was clear that there were a lot of mixed feelings among the men about the prospect of facing harpies. Some of them were scared, but even the most terrified of men kept his place in the ranks. A few of the soldiers even seemed more than a little bit eager to get into combat with the huntresses. Anida gripped her sword tightly. She could feel herself sweating, and even caught herself holding her breath. Harpies had excellent hearing, and yet she could shout at a harpy standing right on the other side of the dome, and thanks to the magic of the dome, the harpy wouldn't hear a word. Yet not only Anida, but every soldier under her command seemed to be doing their very best to make no noise whatsoever. Not too far away, Kel suddenly seemed to have realised that Mini-Tilda hadn't fled with the rest of the children. He reappeared, running back for his sister. He grabbed her from behind and tried to drag her back with him. Mini-Tilda refused to budge, her eyes glued to the skies. Evidently seeing no other alternative, the young boy stood in front of his sister, and without the benefit of even a wooden sword, he scowled at the harpies and prepared to defend his sibling with his very life. Anida couldn't help but smile. That boy might be a bully, But he was also very brave. His heart seemed to be in the right place. One day he was going to make an excellent duke. Anida couldn't allow herself to be distracted by the children for long though. The Harpies were very close now. She looked back at the flock just in time to see the ones at the front come into land almost immediately outside the illusory dome. Just beyond the magical pillars, Harpies started to take perches in the trees, while others broke away from the flock in small groups of between 4 and 6, a traditional size for Harpy hunting parties, and flew off in every direction, except over the dome. "Get ready," someone shouted. "They know we're here." "Wait," Anida countered. The Harpies didn't look as if they were getting ready for combat. It looked more as if they were finding a place to settle for the night. It was already early evening and it would be dark soon. Harpies didn't like to hunt during the night as they couldn't see their prey. It was probably no more than a coincidence that they happened to have landed right outside the pillars. One thing that did worry Anida for a moment was how the hunting party seemed to be actively ignoring the dome. It could be a sign that the Harpies knew the dome was there, but she thought it was more likely that huntresses had already scouted out their hunting grounds and were just heading back now to collect their prey. "Now what?" one of the soldiers asked. "We watch them," Anida said. "We keep a careful eye on them and hope that none of them finds a way into the encampment." She looked round at the men. "When Mangloss gets here, we'll get him to close this doorway just in case. Hopefully they'll be gone by early morning." "I don't think so," one of the soldiers said. "Look what they're doing." It was hard to see what the soldier meant at first. A lot of the Harpies were hanging about in the tops of the trees, perched on the higher branches, as if they were acting as lookouts. A small group of the youngest Harpies were flitting from tree to tree, playing some kind of mock battle game. Other young children were getting some fires ready so the returning huntresses would have a place to cook their bounty. A group of huntresses were busy felling one of the trees. "What am I looking at?" Anida asked. The soldier pointed at the Harpies felling the tree. "If they just planned to spend the night here, they wouldn't bother to clear part of the forest. I think they're planning to move in." "Maybe they're just making temporary shelters," Anida suggested. "Maybe," the soldier agreed, though his voice suggested he didn't believe it. "I wish I could understand what they were saying," Anida muttered. Being just on the other side of the illusory dome wall, the Harpies were so close that Anida felt she could almost reach out and touch them. She could hear the chatter as they talked to each other. They were close enough for her to make out some of the actual words, but her knowledge of the Harpy language began and ended with the little that Jenny had taught her. Anida kept her eyes fixed on one particular group of Harpies who were venturing dangerously close to the pillars. There were 3 in that group, one of whom was the village's male. The 3 of them seemed to be quite vocal. Anida wished Jenny was here. Jenny spoke the language. She would know what the Harpies were discussing, and then Anida would know for sure if the encampment was in danger. Anida looked at the female to the right of the male. She was unarmed and unadorned except for a fancy-looking medallion that she wore about her neck. Something else jumped out about this Harpy. She was pregnant. Anida breathed out deeply and smiled to herself. She took a step closer to the pillars and then looked back at the gathered soldiers. "Stand down." "But," someone protested. "Panic is over," Anida insisted. She looked back at the 3 Harpies. The pregnant one was Gaggara, and the male was Reyes. She recognized him easily now, the ring on his finger removing any doubt. "They are of no threat to us." "But," someone repeated, "they're getting very close to the pillars. They could enter the camp." "They should never put a woman in command," someone else commented. "They've got no backbone." Anida sighed. She looked round at the soldiers and then back at the Harpies. It scared her for a moment that Reyes, the man she had grown to know as the son of the old Duke the Moth, now had an entire village with him. But then she hadn't known Gaggara before Reyes had introduced them, and Anida felt she got on all right with her. Reyes couldn't know what was waiting for him if he stepped through the pillars. Anida hadn't been able to defuse the situation enough. In the end, she could only think of one thing she could do. Anida stepped between the pillars, leaving the encampment.